Hello, and welcome to the webinar about understanding and responding to elder abuse. My name is Martha Jane Lewis, and I'm with the BC Centre for Elder Advocacy and Support. Victim Services has created a new resource for workers so that you can learn about elder abuse, how to help your older clients, and what resources are available. Canada's population is aging at a rate never imagined before. We're expecting to see a much larger number of older adults becoming victims of abuse. And this leads to some important questions. For example, why might some of these clients be different from the younger clients that you get? Are the forms of abuse likely to be different depending on the age of the person? And if so, why? The new Victim Services ebook, Understanding and Responding to Elder Abuse, will answer these questions as well as others, such as what factors can make one older adult more vulnerable to abuse than another older adult? And what are the likely characteristics of an abuser? In this webinar, I'm not going to simply go over the information that you can find in the ebook. Instead, I want to talk about the following topics. First of all, there are important concepts often raised when dealing with older adults, whether it's in a medical context or a legal context. These are mental capacity. People often use the term capacity and some use the term capable. They're pretty interchangeable. Then there's consent and mental confusion. I'll then talk about financial abuse because this is the type of abuse that is most often suffered by older adults. And then I'll refer briefly to the ebook itself. Starting point in our law is that all adults have the capacity to make decisions for themselves. This is called presumed capacity. However, sometimes adults may acquire a brain injury that affects their ability to make decisions. Others may acquire a medical condition that affects the ability of the brain to process information. We'll talk in a little while more about what is actually meant by capacity. Then there is the concept of range of capacity. And we all have ranges of capacity. They can be task-specific or time-specific. In terms of task-specific, I cannot duplicate, let alone fully understand, the work done by Albert Einstein or Stephen Hawking. Yet I do have capacity to decide what I want to eat for breakfast every day. So capacity or capability is task-specific. However, our society tends to judge people who have some limitations on their range of capacity. And too often, we assume that because someone does not have capacity to balance their checkbook, they don't have capacity to take care of themselves in other ways. This is part of ageism, when we start treating older adults as if they have diminished capacity for all decisions. Start treating them as if they're children, maybe even start to doubt that what they say or express is important or even correct. The third concept is consent. This is a very important concept. When people are forced to act in a certain way, for example, transferring ownership of their house to a daughter even though they don't want to, Are they really giving consent for this action? When older adults feel forced to give away money or property that they don't really want to, it can be the result of emotional or psychological or even physical abuse. However, if the older adult transfers the property and the daughter was not holding a gun to her mother's head to get her to sign the paper, did the mother give consent to the act of transferring the property? Or if the mother has advanced dementia and no idea of what she's signing, is there consent? Well, those are both obviously not. But if the mother knew full well what she was doing, even though she didn't really want to, did she consent to transfer the house? If the woman has capacity, can the act of transferring the property be undone? Another issue is mental confusion. This is a temporary situation, and it's often difficult for a worker to know if the older adult is feeling confused at the time of the meeting, perhaps because they're under stress, or if the older adult has reduced capacity to make decisions. And finally, how do capacity and consent connect to financial elder abuse? Legal capacity is defined in Black's Law Dictionary. You can see here where capable, capacity are used to have similar meanings. Capable means possessing legal capacity, and capacity is the ability to understand the nature and the effect of one's actions. Capacity is a legal finding, and it's based on medical evidence. Often people think capacity is purely legal, and they don't realize that people can challenge a finding of incapacity, even within the courts. Now, capability is basically about decision-making. And decision-making includes the ability to consent. Here's another definition from Black's Law Dictionary. Consent being an act of reason accompanied with deliberation. The mind weighing is in a balance, the good or evil on each side. It means voluntary agreement by a person in the possession and exercise of sufficient mental capacity to make an intelligent choice to do something proposed by another. In the medical context, one gets into informed consent, which means the older adult has to have the results of medical treatment fully described so that they can give informed consent as to whether or not they want that treatment. So consent alone isn't enough. It has to be informed consent. Now, as I said earlier, capacity is task specific. So we look at the capacity to do what acts, what decisions. They can be very easy ones, such as what you feel like eating at the moment, all the way to much more difficult decisions, how to handle one's property, one's finances, how to fill out an income tax return, who to give power of attorney to. And earlier we said that capacity is time specific. So people may not have capacity to make difficult decisions when they're tired, when they're hungry, when they're in a stressful situation. So we have to distinguish between capacity and temporary mental confusion. In the Victim Service ebook, there are some tips about how and where to meet with an older adult to help reduce the stress, to help combat some confusion, so that it's easier to see that the person does have capacity to control their lives, to make their decisions. They're just temporarily confused. And we have to be careful not to assume that when an older adult is feeling confused, it means that they lack capacity to make any decisions. And how does capacity connect to financial abuse? They connect on several levels. One is just that the older adult's lack of capacity might make them more vulnerable. They might not be able to clearly see that the check they're being made to sign or feel forced to sign is not something they can really be affording to do, that it's going to leave them in hardship. Some older adults do have capacity, but under moments of stress, feeling confused, they'll agree to what the abuser wants them to do. Now, people have the right to make unwise decisions at any age. It doesn't mean they don't have capacity. We certainly can look at some very young people who drive too fast and take big risks. We don't consider they don't have capacity. We just think they're making foolish decisions. So we have to bear in mind capacity and wisdom aren't necessarily the same thing either. But even if somebody does tend to make unwise decisions, that doesn't mean it's okay for them to be abused, obviously. And we have to try and assess if the abuse is linked to somebody's incapacity or if it's something the older adult may make a decision to go along with rather than be denied access to see their grandchildren, for example, or alienate their child who they depend on for caregiving. Capacity also is important because it impacts what steps authorities can take to intercede in a situation where the older adult may be being financially abused. If it's deemed that the older adult has capacity, then designated agencies, public guardian trustees are more limited in what steps they can take to assist that person. There's more information about that within the e-book, Understanding and Responding to Elder Abuse. Now, financial abuse is generally considered to be the most common form of abuse experienced by older adults because the abuser is trying to get property, money, possessions. They can easily be separated into two categories. One is where the abuser is known to the older adult. They can be as close as family members or just visitors to the place where the older adult is living, or people they've met through their religious community who are preying on older adults. But then it also involves abuse by complete strangers. We call these frauds and scams. Financial abuse, where the abuser is known to the older adult, can be very tragic because often the abuser is somebody that the older adult has trusted, maybe even loved, and has been very close to. When the abuser is known to the older adult, there can be both intentional and unintentional abuse. For example, an adult child can feel fully entitled to use the parent's savings, knowing that they're going to inherit the money one day anyway. They may really believe that the parent, for example, who isn't able to communicate because of diminished capacity, would want them to use some of their money to put a grandchild through nursing school or to help her with a down payment on a condo. These beliefs about what the older adult would want may be correct, But if the older adult never prepared written instructions to this effect, how can it be proven legally? Who can judge what's morally correct? On the other hand, you may have an adult child who knows full well that by getting their hands on the senior savings, there may not be enough left over to pay for support services or treatments that would make the senior's quality of life better in, say, 10 years' time, because that adult child is spending their parents' savings now. Here again, whether or not the older adult is mentally capable is an important consideration. Now, the slide here lists some factors about financial abuse where the abuser is known to the older adult. This can affect people regardless of their financial situation. Very wealthy people can be victims, also very low-income people who are depending on a monthly government benefit and have no other savings or possessions at all. There's usually an aspect of emotional or psychological abuse here, sometimes even physical abuse. The Victim Service e-book provides some ideas about what may make the older adult vulnerable to the abuser. If there's physical violence within the family and a history of that, the older adult may be afraid of being hit. Other times it's more emotional pressure, where the older adult is told they'll be put into a home if they don't provide money to the children they're living with. So it can be something as small as taking cash, right up to forcing the transfer of property to a relative. Commonly, it's what are called loans. The older adult may have given their large amount of their life savings to a relative who's just lost their job or who wants to buy a home, and there's a vague promise that this money will be repaid when the older adult needs it. And then the older adult runs into real financial hardship, and the relatives say, well, it wasn't a loan, it was a gift. There's nothing in writing either way. These are very sad situations. Sometimes it involves going to small claims court. Other times the sums are larger than that. They're very challenging cases. Also, where the abuser is known to the older adult, can be cases of joint bank accounts. That happens commonly where the older adult child has their name put on the joint bank account with the parent so that they can go and write checks for the parent, take spending money out of the bank account for them. And then there are powers of attorney. When the abuse involves financial abuse and the abuser is known to the older adult, reporting it can be problematic. The Victim Service e-book lists reasons why an older adult may not want this to be reported at all. As for ways to prevent continued financial abuse of an older adult, the worker can have a very strong role to play here in providing emotional support, in providing information, in helping the older adult work out what they can tell the abuser to explain why they can't give them more money, for example. Now, joint bank accounts and powers of attorney, it's very sad because these are often misused by people whom the older adult trusted the most. Well, otherwise, they wouldn't have made arrangements for the abuser to have access to their property through these instruments. And the e-book gives examples of when an older adult is most likely to be at risk. For example, a woman who's very recently widowed, when it was her husband who always took care of the financial affairs of the family. Here again, the options for responding to abuse depend on whether the older adult is is deemed to be capable of making his or her own decisions or not. The Victim Service e-book sets out what the public guardian trustee, what designated agencies can do, depending on whether or not the older adult has capacity to report abuse and to take steps to protect themselves. However, there are things here that the older adult can do to prevent further abuse. One of the best is to set up a meeting with the bank manager. The bank manager can give advice about setting up a new, smaller account that the caregiver can have access to, for example, through an ATM machine, in order to pick up spending money for the older adult, or to get money to do grocery shopping for the older adult. But this denies the abuser from having access to the larger savings of the older adult that are put aside in a savings account, for example, or RSPs. Then we have setting up automatic bill payment, and then there's less need for an older adult to be writing checks, or for the older adult to have their joint power of attorney and joint bank account holder writing checks on their behalf. Many older people are not aware that they can revoke a power of attorney. The process is not onerous. And then the older adult can name a new person to take over instead. Financial abuse by strangers. This is something that seems to be growing. Older adults are targeted. The most recent numbers I've heard in Canada is that 80% of the victims of scams are older adults. And it's very hard to track down who these scammers are. There are many reasons why older adults are particularly susceptible to scams. And isolated older adults can be the most vulnerable. They may be lonely, they don't have many visitors, they don't get a lot of phone calls, they don't get a lot of mail from friends. And so they're quite open to responding to scams. Whether it's on the phone, they can be happy to talk to somebody who calls them, even strangers. And they'll write checks in response to pleas from charities. Of course, many of them are very valuable charities, but the older adults sometimes will give more money than they can afford to do. Then we have the scammers around family emergencies. A phone call to say that a grandson or granddaughter has had their passport and airline ticket stolen, or that they've been picked up and are in jail for some reason and need somebody to post bail for them. And often the scammers will say there's a lawyer of the grandchild and that the child doesn't want the parents to know what's going on, and they ask the older adult to keep it secret and to wire money. Apparently Facebook is being used to track the travels of younger people, and there may be something on Facebook which indicates where the grandparents are. These are very elaborate scams. However, so much money can sometimes be made if just a handful of people fall victim to these scams, that it's worth them trying it on over large numbers, many of whom won't respond that way. Dating websites is a growing area as well. Lonely older person can become emotionally very attached to a non-existent person over a website, can end up, after months of a building relationship, sending money to help that person out because of a family emergency, for example. And the sad thing is that the victim not only has lost money, but they may suffer heartache when they find out that that person didn't even exist, that they fell in love with a fiction. And it can be embarrassing as well. Door-to-door salesmen, we get calls quite frequently about older adults who bought vacuum cleaners because the older adult enjoyed having a visit from the salesperson who came to their home. And so they'll spend thousands of dollars on something they don't need. We've had one case of a woman even buying a hot tub and having it installed, though she wasn't able physically to access it. There's just a growing need to help older adults be aware of the scams and frauds that are out there waiting for them. The RCMP has created a very good resource, and the Victim Service ebook does provide a link to where to get more information about this. So the new toolkit or ebook, Understanding and Responding to Elder Abuse, provides a lot of information. It also provides live links and videos to help workers support older adults. There's information that can be printed off for the workers or their clients. The important thing to bear in mind working with older adults who may be victims of abuse is the question of capacity, of capability, of giving consent, of making decisions that they were able to make, and bearing in mind that the support and resources available also are a factor of the capacity of the older adult. The Victim Service ebook does provide links to websites where workers can get more information about all of this information. Thank you very much.